For over 65 episodes, Kiyaya and Daniel have been here sharing great literature for kids and adolescents. It's time to sit back, relax, and get cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel. The book we were about to read was brought to my attention in a most unusual way. One Friday afternoon, just before closing time, I heard a scratching sound at the front door of my office. When I opened the door, there before me stood a sad-eyed, droopy-eared dog carrying a large, plain envelope in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet, gave me a soulful glance, and with great, quiet dignity, sauntered away. Inside the envelope was a manuscript of the book you now hold in your hands, together with this letter. Gentlemen, the enclosed story is true. It happened in this very town, to me and the family with whom I reside. I have changed the names of the family in order to protect them, but in all other respects you will read here is factual. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Harold. I come to writing purely by chance. My full-time occupation is dog. I live with Mr. and Mrs. X, called here the Monroes, and their two sons, Toby, age 8, and Pete, age 10. Also sharing our home is a cat named Chester, whom I am pleased to call my friend. We were a typical American family, and still are, though the events related in my story have of course, had their effect on our lives. I hope you will find this tale of sufficient interest to yourself and your readers to warrant its publication. Sincerely, Harold X. Starting today on Let's Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel, we are going to be sharing this manuscript. Celebrating over 40 years in print, James Howe's Bunnicula. It starts today on Bunnicula Tuesdays on Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel.
Hi, my name is Donnell Carter, certified personal trainer through National Academy of Sports Medicine, and certified nutrition coach through Precision Nutrition. I'm here today to talk to you about online personal training, the future of personal training right on your phone. We start the week with an overview and progress reports. Following that, we have our calendar, day 3, 4, 5 different workouts. Further in depth, we see exactly what we're doing for the day. Find out more information, contact me.
Stories are such an important part of our lives. Join my friend Kiyaya and I for Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel, where we share some of the greatest picture books and chapters from children's and young adult literature to inspire you to keep embedding literacy into your days. Chapter 1, The Arrival. I shall never forget the time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of their house until they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You're the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen, and people think you're being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice, whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about that first night. Well, it was cold. The rain was pelting on the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle. A bundle with tiny, glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad!" "Take off your boots. You're soaking wet," replied his mother, somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. "But, Mom, what about the—" "First, stop dripping on the carpet." "Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with his eyes. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," Pete yelled. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him." "You'll drop him." "I will not." "You will too." "Mom, Pete punched me." "I'll take him," said Mrs. Monroe. "Take off your coats this minute." But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was still there. "Harold!" cried Toby. "Guess what happened to me?" And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her own intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just, "Good boy, Harold," or "Use the litter box, Chester," at our house. Oh no, with us it's, "Hey, Harold, Dad got a raise and now we're in a higher tax bracket." Or, "Come sit on the bed, Chester, and watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you'll see a relative." Which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor, and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer. So we think of it as rather a special household, and we are, therefore, rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived late at the theater, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and moved to another seat, but in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they saw on Toby's chair was the little blanketed bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been written and tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby," but I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate, and Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moseyed over to the corner of the room. We looked at each other. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma! Toby broke the rabbit's house!" "I didn't, I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big. Toby's too little." "I am not. You are too." "Okay, fellas," Mrs. Monroe called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At the moment, the crate arrived, barely standing in the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. "Ma, Toby says he's going to keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room." Only sometimes, I thought, when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shares his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake. And Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing. And the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears so I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. "But he's mine," said Toby. "I found him." "You sat on him, you mean?" "I found him, and he's sleeping in my room." "You can keep smelly old Harold in your room, and Chester too if you want to, but I'm going to keep the rabbit in mine." Smelly old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly, indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room on that table by the window. It's light there, and he'll get lots of fresh air." "Pete's taller than I am," cried Toby. "He'll be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Monroe through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. "I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Monroe smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby. "He's not drinking his milk." Chester nudged me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" he asked. "Excuse me, while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby, "we gotta name him." "Can't that wait till tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison, "No! He has to have a name right now." I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were going to name me Fluffy, or as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. "Well, all right," said Mrs. Monroe. "What about, say, Bun Bun?" Oh, there she goes again, I thought. Where does she get them? "Yeah," we all said. "Well then, how about Fluffy?" she offered hopefully. Pete looked at his mother and smiled. "You never give up, do you, Ma?" Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Monroe's ankles and purring loudly. "No, Chester, not now," she said, pushing him aside. "He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester?" Toby asked as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. "Come on, Harold," Toby called. "You've got to help with the name, too." I joined the family, and serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I'd really seen him. "So this is a rabbit," I thought. "He sort of looks like Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail, and a motor in his nose." "Well," said Pete after a moment, "since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson?" There was a moment of silence. "Who's Mr. Johnson?" asked Toby. "The guy who owns the movie theater," Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. "How about Prince?" said Mr. Monroe. "Dad," said Toby, "are you kidding?" "Oh, I once had a dog named Prince," he replied lamely. Prince, I thought, was a silly name for a dog. "We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula," Toby said. "That's a stupid name," said Pete. "No, it's not. And anyway, I found him, so I get to name him." "Mom, you're not going to let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do." Mrs. Monroe looked in wonder at Pete. "Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula," cried Toby. "Please, please, please." And with each please, he squeezed Chester a little harder. Mrs. Monroe picked up the bowl of milk and moved it towards the kitchen. Chester followed her every moment with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, "Let's not have any more arguments, we'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him in a Dracula movie, so we call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula! That should make everybody happy, including me." "What about me?" muttered Chester. "I won't be happy till she puts down that milk." "Well, guys, is that okay with you?" she asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another and at the rabbit, and a smile grew on Toby's face. "Yeah, Ma, I think that name's all right." Pete shrugged. "It's okay, but I get to feed him." "Okay, I'm going to put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he'll drink it tomorrow." "What about Chester?" Toby said, dropping the frantic cat to the floor. "Maybe he would like it." Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Monroe and looked at her plaintively. "Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today." She reached down and patted Chester on the head and walked into the kitchen. Chester didn't move. "Okay, bedtime," said Mrs. Monroe. "Good night, Bunnicula," Toby said. "Good night, Count Bunnicula," Pete said sarcastically in which I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. "Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester." I licked Toby good night. "Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester." I drooled on Pete's foot. "Mom, Harold drooled on my foot." "Good night, Pete," Mrs. Monroe said with great finality as she came back from the living room. And then, more calmly, "Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester." Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. "You know, dear," Mr. Monroe said, "that was very clever. Bunnicula. I could never have thought of a name like that." "Oh, I don't know, Robert," she smiled and put her arm through his. "I think Prince is a lovely name, too." The room was quiet. Chester was still by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly, he turned to me. "I wish they had named him Fluffy," was all he said. Chapter 2. The Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He's not your ordinary cat, but then I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Monroe, along with 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and a first edition of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Monroe was an English professor, Chester developed a taste of reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste for books. I found Jonathan Livingston Seagull particularly delicious. From Chester's kittenhood on, Mr. Monroe has used him as a sounding board for all of his student lectures. If Chester doesn't fall asleep when Mr. Monroe is talking, the lecture can be counted a success. Every night, when the family is sleeping, Chester goes to the bookshelf, selects his midnight reading, and curls up on his favorite chair. He especially likes mystery stories and tales of horror and the supernatural. As a result, he has developed a very vivid imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it's important for you to know something of Chester's background before I relate to you the story of the events following the arrival of Bunnicula into our home. Let me begin with that first night. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with his latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course, since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit's cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and rain had stopped, and as Chester read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. "I don't know what came over me," he said to me the next morning, "but a cold chill ran down my spine." The little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he'd been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ears back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed the peculiar marking on his forehead. What seemed like an ordinary black spot between his ears took on a strange V-shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked like he was wearing a coat. No, more like a cape than a coat. Through the silence had drifted the strains of a remote and exotic music. I could have sworn it was a gypsy violin, Chester told me. I thought perhaps a caravan was passing by. So I ran to the window. I remembered my mother telling me something about caravans when I was a puppy, but for the life of me I couldn't remember what. What's a caravan? I asked, feeling a little stupid. A caravan is a band of gypsies traveling through the forest in their wagons, Chester answered. Ah, yes, it was coming back to me now. Station wagons? No, covered wagons. The gypsies travel all through the land, setting up camps and great bonfires, do magical tricks. And sometimes, if you cross their palms with a piece of silver, they'll tell your fortune. You mean if I gave them a fork, they'd tell me my fortune? I asked breathlessly. Chester looked at me with disdain. Save your silverware. He said, it wasn't a caravan after all. I was disappointed. What was it? I asked. Chester explained that when he looked out the window, he saw Professor Micklewhite, our next-door neighbor, playing the violin in his living room. He listened for a few moments to the haunting melody and sighed with relief. I've really got to stop reading these horror stories late at night, he thought. It's beginning to affect my mind. He yawned and turned to go back to his chair and get some sleep. As he turned, however, he was startled by what he saw. There, in the moonlight, as the music filtered through the air, sat the bunny, his eyes intense and staring, an unearthly aura about them. Now this is the part you won't believe, Chester said to me. But as I watched, his lips parted in a hideous smile, and where a rabbit's buck teeth should have been, two pointed little fangs glistened. I wasn't sure what to make of Chester's story, but the way he told it, it set my hair on end. Kiyaya, and I hope you enjoyed chapters 1 and 2 of James Howe's Bunnicula. You know, Kiyaya, when I was a kid and struggled as a reader and couldn't find things to read, Bunnicula was the book that my mother got me to read on my own. I really enjoyed it, and I loved telling her all about what I read. And now I'm very happy to be sharing this great book with all of you. We'll be back tomorrow for another episode of Let's Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel. Remember, reading is power.